This is The Edge with your hosts, Jonathan Von Tobel.
All right, welcome in here in The Edge. My name's Jonathan Von Tobel. You know it, and we have an hour on tap today. A great show on tap, as we usually do, because not only are we going to touch on one of our NHL series, Coyotes taking on the Predators. We'll have breakdown on that analysis. We'll have an update on the series price as well. Later in the show, we'll have our Major League Baseball division previews too. We're in the National League, NL East, a very interesting league, considering that all of these teams really tight in terms of the odds. Wrap it up. Jeff Motley's going to be with us at the desk as we look ahead to the Quaker State 400. We're touching on all the bases here today. Let's head out because I'm actually really excited to pick the brain of Paul here. Paul Rabil, of course, again, co-founder, Premier Lacrosse League, is with us to discuss what's going on with the PLL and what we're going to see here at the end of July. So, Paul, I appreciate some time. Thank you very much. So, there's a lot to get to. So, let's just start with this. Give us the down low on what the PLL is, what the tournament is coming up later this month, and on top of that, add why you think, because I would assume that sports betting for a sport in a league that is trying to get its legs underneath it would be beneficial, because if you bet on it, you got action, you want to watch it. So I know I threw a lot at you there, but give us the down low on everything that we got going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
And I'll start backwards going forward. So for a long time in sports, there have been analysts, journalists, even comedians that say it's not a real sport unless you can bet on it. And we knew that going into really building the PLL, which is the Premier Lacrosse League, comprised of the best lacrosse players in the world. We have 7 teams. Traditionally, we play all summer long into September. Obviously, with this global pandemic, us, like the legacy leagues, all huddled up and tried to figure out a way to build a solution so that we could play. And we've done that. So what we did was shorten a season that spanned 15 weeks beginning in June and ended in September to this like March Madness World Cup style 2.5 week tournament. So there's going to be a group play between all 7 teams the first week beginning July 25th, and then single elimination in the second week that leads to our champion being crowned on August 9th. All of the games are broadcasted on NBC Sports family of networks. 2 of the first 3 games on July 25th and July 26th, which is Saturday and Sunday, are going to be on NBC at 4 p.m. Eastern time, and then primetime windows on NBC Sports Net. So we're really excited not only about our league, but the distribution that we have. And then this year, as we had been working on it throughout 2017, it is officially turned on sports betting. And we went through all of the regulators across at least the 18 states now that have sports betting legal, and we know there's an additional 5 that have bills proposed, and another 23 or so that have bills that are going to be introduced or have just been introduced. So sports betting in the U.S. is a big piece legally that now that leagues are and gaming operators are leaning into, which formerly, as we know, was done privately and illegally through sports books off the record. So. As we're showing up on this graphic here, William Hill set our futures. We're hoping to disclose markets in the coming week, whether it's totals, money lines, spreads, and even some props.
So let's get into, before we get to specific teams, I'm always curious. We actually were talking about this yesterday. We were talking about soccer, right, and evaluating soccer teams and, strength of positions. And you go back to the NFL, right? The quarterback, the most important position. And obviously we talk about how much a quarterback is worth to his point spread. We know how much weight the quarterback position holds. So we're talking about just teams in general in lacrosse. Walk us through evaluating a team overall in terms of position groups, the importance of each position group, and where would you start your research in that realm if you're going to get into betting the Premier Lacrosse League?
Yeah, I think you always start with your star players. And in football, it's easier to go toward the quarterback, because if the quarterback's completion rate is high and they're getting the ball and they're moving the ball down the field, that team's more likely to win. Defenses, like in football, they're kind of grouped together. And I think the same thing in lacrosse. You don't focus on one potentially MVP candidate and that person leading your decision around a bet. I think you look at the midfield and attack position and the goal scorers. And again, just like in basketball, if LeBron James is going to go off and score 30 plus points and have, a triple double, they're more likely to win. And so I think you look at ex-attackmen more granularly. Those are our version of quarterbacks on the field. They stay on the field the entire time. And then you have midfielders that have the ability to take over the game. Much like soccer, they play back and forth. And have the ability to take over.
Is there like a league? Because I like numbers. Do you guys where are you guys at in terms of your database for statistics? What are statistics for lacrosse like at this point right now, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I would encourage you and everyone to check out a new Instagram and Twitter account we launched called PLL Bet, and we have an advanced statistics team that is new to the sport, much like sports betting is new to lacrosse, and it's a game that's been around for centuries, frankly, and has been played at the college level, at the NCAA level since the early '70s. So this is all very new, but statistics are pretty evolved, and I think at a high level, you look at goals, assists, ground balls, takeaways, which are a defensive stat. Then you look at goalie save percentage. You look at face-off position. That's a position that is really interesting to us. It's much like hockey. There's a face-off that determines the possession after every goal, different than, say, soccer or basketball, where the team who just got scored on then gets it. So you have an ability to go on runs in lacrosse, and that makes the face-off position really interesting and valuable, but also a potential target for a prop bet on a goal-to-goal basis within. So I would look at goals, assists, much like soccer. But then if you look at advanced statistics in soccer, we're now looking at time of ball and stick for any player, passing from a quantitative standpoint, every game, completed passes. So you look at soccer again, a guy like Xavi Hernandez in Barcelona, who set records in the early 2000s of completing 100 passes in a game. That's an interesting prop bet in the future for lacrosse, is who has the ball in their stick, who's the field general. So it's a really exciting sport. There's so many intricacies.
So if you go over, by the way, and again, the Twitter account, PLL Bets, and I was actually looking through this earlier today and last night. One of the things that stuck out to me from the account, more than half, 19 to 37 of all games in 2019 decided by one possession. It leads you to think that parity is pretty rife with the Premier Lacrosse League. The futures odds say that as well. So this is a league, it seems like, right, that all the teams are on relatively even footing?
Yeah, I mean, imagine the NBA contracting to 7 teams, or the NFL doing the same. We certainly have a really deep talent pool in lacrosse professionally as well. But starting this league from scratch, we did so with 6 teams in our inaugural season last year, and then we expanded to a 7th. So you're getting, this all-star level caliber per team, and so that can lead to fireworks where every game or more than half of the games are decided by one possession, or certainly can be on a momentum spinoff where one team takes over. And we did have a handful of games where a team was winning by 10 plus goals.
I'm curious, because obviously Paul here, if you're watching VSiN.com, which you should be, Paul, of course, is an active player in the Premier Lacrosse League. What do you think your value is to like a futures board or a point spread?
Yeah, well, I'd say partially I'm a pretty talented player that have been playing at a high level for the last decade. But it's an interesting thing having co-founded this league with my brother Mike, and then having to carefully, and we had these conversations with all the regulators in advance, and then obviously the gaming operators, is that we have bifurcated clearly our lacrosse ops team. So our VP of lacrosse all the way down through integrity officials to head of officials and referees and so on. So I, much like July 25th, when that starts in our training camp that precedes it, I take off my league cap and put on my helmet and just play on field. So my hope is that for those who bet on Atlas, is that I can prove you right and return some money to your pocket.
All right, so let's take a look at some of these teams. And again, as we noted, William Hill has posted futures at this point right now for the Premier Lacrosse League. And Paul, one more time for people who are watching, just give the date when the tournament's going to start, July 27th?
It's July 25th, so 25th. It's a Saturday. The first game's at 4 p.m. on NBC Eastern Time, and then the championship game is on August 9th. So it's 20 games in 16 days.
Yep. So I noted the parity. So if you're looking at the futures board, you have Whip Snakes at 3-1, the favorite to win the Premier Lacrosse League. Chaos sitting at 4-1. They got 3 other teams sitting at plus 450. They'd be the Archers, Redwoods, and Atlas. So let's just start with this. Let's look at the top 2 teams, the Whip Snakes and the Chaos. Clearly, odds makers are saying there's a small difference between the two. In your mind, are those odds accurate? And what is the difference between the two?
So the odds have already moved a little bit, yep. And because I'm looking at my team at plus 450, I think we were around 800 when they first were set. And if you look at originally where William Hill was going, it was based off of the leaderboard at the end of a regular season in 2019, and then how the playoffs went. So Chaos were the number 1 team at the end of the regular season last year, and then the Whips won the championship. So I think that's why you have the 2 up top, is you're going based off of momentum and how they finished last year, and that's consistent with other leagues. But then if you look at Archers, Redwoods, those were 2 semifinalists, equally had a chance to take the title. And then Atlas, I think we're an interesting one. We're like the Dallas Cowboys or the New England Patriots or, the Boston Celtics of the 80s or 70s or 80s, where we've got, again, I'm partial, but we've got a lot of the top talent in the league. We didn't play well last year, and we got kind of pushed out of the playoffs on a tiebreaker. So it's one of those things as oddmakers said, well, on paper, they've got all this talent, but they didn't win last year. So where do they fall? And I think that's where we've slid up to plus 450. Chrome finished last year, and the Water Dogs are our expansion team. The interesting thing with Water Dogs is, just like an expansion team in other sports leagues, what you do is all of the coaches and the GMs contract and they protect the players they want to keep. And then you have another half of your roster that's unprotected. Those are selected by the expansion team's coaches. And then you go to market with a chip on your shoulder. So their slogan is every game is a revenge game. And that's one thing that we know as kind of odds makers and viewers of sports is you can make a guess or a wager based off of stats, but you can never and should never underestimate the kind of the firepower of the mind amidst athletes. So these guys are considered the rejects of this season, and I would assume that's why they got the nod, at least on favorites or futures over Chrome.
Yeah, and by the way, too, out here in Vegas, we at least have seen that up close and personal. Vegas Golden Knights, of course, the right expansion team, and then they go,
there you go.
In the first year all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals. So I'm curious, in your mind, when you look at these, because obviously sports betting all about finding edges, and what's interesting about sports like this is when you introduce them at first to the market, it's obviously, people aren't as involved with it, and there's some really sharp bettors who probably follow it. So what I'm getting at is, when you look at these order of teams in terms of futures, do you see an edge with one team or the other that you think is maybe a little undervalued, that the odds makers don't really know too much about them? And you're saying, like, for example, Atlas at plus 450, maybe realistically we should probably be more at 350 or 300, and thus our implied probability goes up because those odds makers don't really know the intricacies of how these teams are built.
Yeah, well, I think as we had talked about it, it's a great question, but we're already seeing the odds slide a little bit. And I think that's good because what William Hill's already seen is probably bets coming in and then that's shifting. And then they're also probably tracking their odds makers more of the social conversation. That's a big piece of sports is momentum. And so I think that's part of it. For me, I think the parity that we've seen here demonstrates that statistic that you shared earlier, that over half of the games were decided by one goal. And then we had 9 overtime games. So, and then the structure of the tournament. So there's group play to determine seeding. Remember, there's 20 games in 16 days. So you want to think about endurance, maybe age, average on teams, and different things that could lead to maybe a downturn or an upturn once the elimination round comes. So one thing to keep in mind, no team will be eliminated from the single elimination bracket on the second half of the schedule. So group play determines seeding, win-loss record, and then aggregate score differential, and then head-to-head. The number one team gets a bye, which is really valuable when you have 20 games in 16 days. So they advance immediately into the semifinals, and they'll have more legs under them. So I think we'll see a good fight during group stage. But keep in mind too, if you're playing futures, that even through the group stage, if your team goes 0-4, they could still win the tournament.
All right, Paul, we got 30 seconds left before we have to get out of here. So give us, again, one more time information, when it starts, where we can watch, and what they're going to be watching.
Sure. So our website is PremierLacrosseLeague.com. Follow us on Instagram at PLL, on Twitter at Premier Lacrosse. Our games are on the NBC family of networks beginning July 25th to August 9th. It's 20 games in 16 days. 14 of those games are on television, 4 on the main network, 10 on NBC Sports, and you can catch all of the games on NBC Sports Gold. That's Premier Lacrosse League.
Paul, hey, I appreciate it. Hey, maybe we can get you on again once you get closer to tournament time. Obviously, don't want to bother you while you're playing, but maybe get a little bit more of this information, and we can get some people ready for it, okay?
We'd love that. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Again, Paul Rabil, and check out the Premier Lacrosse League. All right, plenty of show left to get to here on The Edge. We'll come back with a little hockey. We have plenty of golf to get to, too. Oh, and a clip from the world of mixed martial arts.